Thank you all so much for joining us today. This is the Great Minds Think Differently Neurodiversity in Fiction panel. And we have some wonderful guests today. I am Carlin Thomas, and I will be moderating this discussion. And I'd like our panelists to introduce themselves. I'm going to start with Andy, since he is next on my Zoom screen.
Hey, everybody. I am Andy Peliquin, author of sci-fi and fantasy novels. I hope I have intelligent things to say on this discussion.
Thanks, Andy. How about you, Courtney? Let's hear from you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Courtney Radike. I'm a literary agent with the Bel Castro Agency, and I represent YA and adult and science fiction, fantasy, horror, and contemporary mostly.
Excellent. And Leo.
Hi, my name is Lio Lylark. I am a writer, actor, and singer who is also autistic, hence me being here. And I have been currently working on, I mostly do scripts. I actually recently won a runner-up for the Script Angel Scholarship Competition for a pilot that I wrote, but I'm currently working on my first novel, which is really exciting in fantasy. So,
Thanks, Lou. And Nicole.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole. I'm from Puerto Rico, and I mostly used to write fiction, so satire and all of that stuff. But actually, my first book is going to be a nonfiction one, which is kind of crazy. And like Leo, I'm also in the spectrum, hence me being here. I'm super excited to be talking to you guys and just get this going.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. So let's get started. For the purposes of this panel, I'd like you all to describe what neurodiversity is to you as a definition or just how you relate to it. Tell me what neurodiversity means to you. All right, Courtney.
So neurodiversity in itself is just talking about the range of differences like in brain function and behavioral traits in individual people. So when you're talking about having like neurodiverse literature, you're talking about having characters that are both neurotypical and neurodivergent. And so like neurodivergence is basically just like brain functioning that diverges significantly from the typical, and I put that in quotes, like typical brain functioning. It encapsulates like a really wide variety of things. I think most commonly it's referred to in terms of like autism and ADHD, but it also includes things like mental illnesses, epilepsy, migraines, PTSD, things like that. So basically, anytime your brain is not functioning like in a way that neurotypical people do, like that's when you're falling into like the neurodivergent area.
Thank you. Go ahead, Andy.
So a few more that sort of fall into that category are dyslexia, epilepsy, Tourette syndrome, tic disorders. Pretty much any intellectual disability also falls into that. And it's what's interesting. I Googled this, like I always do. It deals with things like learning, like ADHD and attention. Mood is another one that also falls under this neurodiversity. And then of course, I'm also on the spectrum, and sociability, I believe is the word, where we have difficulty with socializing. That falls under the umbrella of neurodiversity.
Thank you, Andy. And Nicole.
Sure. So I just wanted to add that I love that both Kearney and Andy were bringing this part of mental illness that also falls into what neurodivergent is. Basically, like we've all said, it's basically just realizing that all brains work differently and they are wired differently. So we are all in some way neurodivergent, or we don't have to. For me, there's nothing typical anymore. So that's something that I like people bringing more into this, the part of mental illness and how having difficulty with social interactions and just your mood in general can also apply in the realm of neurodivergency.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And Leo.
yeah, I think everyone else did a really good job of setting up like what neurodiversity refers to. And I would just add that a specific aspect of neurodiversity is the celebration of differences. as opposed to stigmatization or attempting to cure or fix. Certain people who have certain types of neurodivergency or neurodiversity may choose to, do things to sort of create accommodations or make their life easier, help them deal with symptoms. But ultimately, part of writing neurodiverse works and championing those is accepting that people can be different and that that is not necessarily a problem or something that needs to be changed.
Thank you so much. I think you all really beautifully covered that whole spectrum. Thank you. So that's a perfect bridge into our next topic. What are some examples of neurodiversity that is done well in books? And what would you call something being done well? What are those qualifications to you? Andy?
Yeah, so I actually just read an amazing book by M.L. Spencer called Dragon Mage. And it's a fairly new book. It's fantasy, it's epic fantasy. It's just a classic, awesome story. But the main character is on the spectrum. Like, he's very clearly on the spectrum. I recognized half of his tics are the same things that I do or things that I know other people do. And so it was so interesting to see this character being the hero of the story. And it's done really well because it's never like his ASD quirks, as it were, are a deficiency. They're just simply part of who they are, or who he is as a person. And ultimately you find out that they are actually the magic of the universe, sort of affecting his brain and making him who he is, but in a really creative and interesting way. And so reading that story, like, I was moved in ways that I have not been by other characters, just because of the depiction of this character through the story. It was an amazing book.
Thank you so much, Andy. All right, so let's see. And Nicole.
Yes, and I definitely agree with what Andy was bringing, and something that Leo was talking about earlier is that celebration of being different and knowing how this isn't something we have to fix, rather something that as we embrace, we can actually grow as a community and as society in general. For me, I know that this goes more into a nonfiction genre, but I've always loved the story of the girl who taught in pictures of Dr. Temple Grandin, just because by seeing that her own experience and just embracing how she herself thinks, she was able to apply it to her science, and she didn't have to be fixed. But there's also some other amazing examples of this in fiction, as words like atypical, where you see people who just have this kind of different quirks, and that's just how they are, and it doesn't mean they're less capable. They are still amazing at what they love to do, and that for me is what makes a good book or a good work with neurodiversity great.
Thank you so much, Nicole. That's wonderful. And go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, so echoing what Andy and Nicole said, I think one that automatically comes to mind for me is Percy Jackson, is one that was done really well with ADHD and dyslexia. I know for me though, trying to find books for this question, because whenever I'm asked a question about specific books, every single book that I've ever read leaves my mind, and I no longer have read anything. but, so researching this question, I found it really frustrating and difficult because it was very hard to find fiction in which the characters were explicitly neurodivergent. Like, I feel like a lot of the time, especially because I tend to go toward more sci-fi and fantasy, and sometimes the world building isn't set up to use terms like autistic and ADHD and like things like that. But things are more coded as neurodivergent rather than like explicitly said that way. And I think that's something that's like shifting a little bit like right now, where even if it's not explicitly said on the page, like authors are more, or like are labeling their characters like as neurodivergent, so that people can find those books when they're looking for them. But that's just definitely something that I'm seeing shift a little bit more, and I'm glad to see it because we need it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Courtney. Leo, did you want to add anything to this topic, or are we good to move on?
I think we're good. These are some really great examples. And Percy Jackson is one that I also really like.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, and Leo, we're going to start with you for the next one, because I know you have a lot to speak to on this. So for our next topic, We want to know, how can someone research more into neurodiversity? What are some good resources for authors or just people who are interested in educating themselves? What are some good resources that they can use for themselves?
Yeah, I think honestly, I would say when you're researching a foundation or a source of information, it's a good idea to see if neurodivergent people are involved in the organization. You want to make sure that this information is being presented with the cooperation of people who are actually on the spectrum and understand it. And I think, honestly, as a writer, what I would say the number one resource that you have when learning how to write about neurodivergence is own voices literature. Reading books about neurodivergent characters written by neurodivergent authors. And you don't necessarily know, some authors are out, some authors are not, but there are own voices books that you can pick up. And when you start to read, 4, 5, 6 books by a neurodivergent author, you can start to see not only what are some patterns that you're seeing in the ways that these characters are presented, what things do they have in common, what things are unique to each individual character, or to that author's writing style, but you also get a sense of how these traits are described on the page. Because a neurodivergent author is more likely to use wording and terminology and describe things in a way that is just more accurate and sensitive than you might get from a clinical article. And that can give you places to go. If you're intrigued by the way that a specific character stims in a novel and how that's described, you can research more into that, and that can give you a jumping off point to kind of get some of the science and why that happens. I would say the other big thing to bear in mind when researching is that you're not attempting to write an accurate autism or an accurate ADHD. You're attempting to write a person. And how someone, I have like a really interesting, I guess, perspective on this, because my wife and I are both neurodivergent, and we both have brothers who are neurodivergent. And just looking at the difference between how we've been treated our entire lives and how specifically our neurodivergence has been treated our entire lives, the way that my brother's autism was diagnosed, was accommodated for, was treated, is just totally different than how I experienced it. And I think I have an example. Recently, my brother-in-law had a bit of a challenge where he decided to be pretty classically homophobic. He went old school with it. And when talking to people, I noticed that consistently people who were close to him would be like, oh, well, he has autism. He doesn't understand. He's confused. And I was frustrated by that, not only because, number one, homophobia is not a symptom of autism. There's not actually much of a correlation there, but also because as a queer trans autistic person, I was seeing a lot in the media about banning trans autistic youth from being able to access transition resources because of the attitude that we are confused and don't understand our own gender identities. And what struck me is it's the exact same ableism. It's the assumption that autistic people aren't capable of understanding or comprehending gender and sexual identity. But when it was applied to a cishet man, it was done in a way where he didn't have to be accountable. It was applied in a way where his behavior was excused and accommodated. Whereas for me, as a queer trans autistic person, it's applied in a way that was harmful and like controls my behavior. And so if you're just going off of, oh, I'm going to write an autistic person, and you're looking at resources that keep my brother-in-law in mind as the example of what autistic people experience, you will write him very accurately and you will write me very badly. So it's important to acknowledge, how does autism intersect with racism? How does it intersect with misogyny? How does it intersect with homophobia? And there are specific resources from people who live that experience. The National Autistic Society actually has articles from trans autistic people, if that's the group that you want to write. So it's important that when you're looking for resources, you're acknowledging where your entire character and how different parts of them might interact. And you're making sure that you're looking at what we are saying about ourselves and our experience.
Thank you so much, Leo. That was fantastic. Courtney, what would you like to add?
Yeah, so definitely echoing what Leo was saying, especially for intersectionality. I mean, definitely similar experiences for me with ADHD. My brother was diagnosed as a teenager, and it took me 25 years to get a diagnosis because of the way that my symptoms present. I think that avoiding sources, or maybe not necessarily avoiding, but being very careful of sources that are strictly from like a very clinical view is a good thing as well. I know that I've found if you're just looking at like research studies or articles done by clinicians that work with neurodivergent patients, something that I've noticed is that they'll list off the DSM-5 criteria as this is what the experience is, but that really doesn't encapsulate what it actually is to be neurodivergent. Like I feel like at least for myself, I definitely am like, oh yeah, like I mean, I experienced these things, but I didn't really feel like seen with a lot of neurodivergent stuff until I actually started talking to and listening to like other neurodivergent people talk about their experiences. And especially with ADHD, because that's something for me that just in the last couple of years like has clicked for me. That was like, oh, that's what's going on. Like, okay. And things like rejection sensitive dysphoria and time blindness and things like that that aren't clinical criteria, but that so many people like experience, that I was like, oh, okay, yeah, this is what my life actually feels like. It's not just like a list of symptoms, it's very much experiences that people have. And also being very, very careful of things like mommy blogs that deal with neurodivergent kids. A lot of the time, those blogs are going to be very ableist and focus on curing, and they don't typically focus on the actual neurodivergent person's perspective and what they need. They talk about how much of a burden they are, and they just focus on that neurotypical perspective. And so, yeah, just definitely what Leo had been saying about making sure that you're trying to listen to actual neurodivergent people when you're looking into research.
Thank you so much, Courtney. That was really good. Andy or Nicole? Nicole, what would you like to add?
Sure. I think just to that, I would stay with both Kearney's and Leo's perspective. I think we have to remember to get that sense of people who are actually going through this instead of going very clinical, because like they said, at times it's not that black and white, especially with this. It's very different from for everyone that's going through some of these things, especially because there's a lot of, like they said, intersectionality with other illnesses and with other experiences that they are going through in their own life. So when you are thinking of researching this, my my advice would be to just look for places where people who are in any way neurodivergent are being represented, be it as an actual author of the site or just in the board that actually works with the whole site. I think a good one that I've seen very recently was the Geek Club books. I think they're really good, and most, if not all, of their board, they are all neurodivergent in some way, and I think that's the important part. Always remembering that this is all of this is a spectrum, so many times you might not be able to just showcase the whole picture, but being very purposeful in looking to actually show a person instead of uh, an illness or a diagnosis, because that's where we go wrong sometimes. We want to show a diagnosis and not necessarily a person.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nicole. And Andy, what would you like to add?
Yeah, just building off of that is that you're not showing everybody's experience with it. Leo said something to this effect. You're not showing everybody's experience with it. You are showing one person's experience. So you're not catering to everybody across the entire spectrum or everybody with ADHD, because everyone's going to have their own specific things, or every dyslexic person. You are showing one person's struggle. And so people are going to identify with 50%, 25%, 100%. Some people may only see one of the things, but that's depicting them accurately. So, like Leo said, research who this person is, not the condition, the neurodivergence, but who this person is and how it would manifest. Because for each of the autistic quirks, or each of the ADHD attention struggles, there is some reason behind it. There is something that is causing it, and it is very unique to each person. So the things that I experience are probably going to be different from Leo's or Nicole's, but there's a reason why we have that. So understanding the reason why behind these characters, it's the same thing. You understand why the character would shoot the bad guy in the head or not shoot the bad guy in the head, or, you know, any other action. I deal in violent stories, so that's kind of what I know. But, you know, so that's kind of the way that you approach it, is why are they doing these things, and whether it's their reaction to an offhand comment from someone or being faced by the end of the world. Everything is governed by some kind of why. So understanding that why will help you to understand who the character is, and that in a way can actually help you like add on the various quirks or divergences that make them accurate for who they are as a person, as opposed to trying to depict everything.
Thank you so much. One more thing I want to expand upon in this topic is if you have any specific sites or resources that you would recommend to people researching these. And it can be autism specific, it can be ADHD specific, it can be anything that you've come across that you think would be good for someone trying to research these topics.
So
Go ahead, Andy.
I actually, one of the characters in my Assassin series has Williams syndrome, which is sort of like this extreme innocence and naivete, and an inability to understand that the world means them harm. I loved this notion of this disorder for a character that I was writing. But then I did the research. I, looked online, Psychology Today, WebMD, all the sort of standard places. But then I actually called psychologists and therapists at the Williams Syndrome Foundation and asked them, look, here's what I'm thinking of doing for my character, based on the sort of surface research that I did, pulled all the bullet points that they have, the nice, easy list. And then I said, look, so here's what I'm thinking of doing to portray the character. And they're like, well, no, it would be better if it was done more like this. And so like talking with someone who has experience, not only from the clinical side of things, but then dealing with people. And obviously the own voices thing is very important, but then there's a lot of these things, these conditions or these neurodivergences that don't actually have own voices writing them. So getting like perspective from people who have a real hands-on experience could in some cases be the closest that we get to finding out these things.
Thank you so much, Andy. That was really helpful. And I think a lot of our people are going to appreciate these resources. Does anyone else have any specific resources they'd like to share? Nicole, go ahead.
I think I mentioned this when I was talking. I forget. But the Geek Club books is actually very focused in autism storytelling. And besides recommending books and resources to understand autism, they also have a blog where a lot of their members talk about their own experiences with triggers and just their whole view of their experience with the spectrum. So I think that one is a really good one because it showcases both authors working with books right now and just people who are telling you their own story in blogs and interviews.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Courtney or Leo, do you have anything you'd like to add? Great. All right, let's move on to the next topic. So let's talk about what are the benefits of recognizing the benefits of recognizing neurodiversity and how it functions. And there's my dyslexia coming in right on topic. So who would like to start us off for this one? And this can be the benefits as a writer or just the benefits interacting in society, just anything. So Courtney, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, so for me, the biggest thing with including neurodiversity and neurodivergence in your literature is the fact that other people with that are neurodivergent, it makes them feel seen. I mean, that's definitely, you know, I feel like for a lot of us, books are definitely like where our home was, like as kids, and whether that's, for neurodivergence, queerness, race, whatever it is, like I feel like a lot of kids, like in particular, like find pieces of themselves like in those books, and that's definitely what it was for me and still is, and what I look for, like when, as an agent that I'm looking for, especially in YA. Wanting to find those books that neurodivergent kids are going to be able to go, oh, that's me. Like, I'm not, because it's neurodivergency can be such an isolating experience sometimes, especially like if the environment and situation that you're in is not one that's supportive. And being able to see other people, in literature and, and online and wherever, but being able to see that is definitely like a, hey, like I'm not all by myself here. Like I'm not inherently broken. There's not something inherently wrong with me. It's not just like me as a person that is experiencing these things and, can't function correctly or whatever. It's like, oh no, like this person knows what I'm feeling. This person also has dealt with the experiences that I deal with and like is able to portray those experiences. And that's like a really big thing, just that feeling seen. I think too, for people who aren't neurodivergent, reading neurodivergent characters, it can definitely open up the conversation and like the mindset of other people don't experience the world the same way that they do. Because I feel like for a lot of neurotypical people, that's something that they don't have to think about very often because, society is set up for neurotypical people. And when you're neurodivergent, I feel like a lot of the time you're just aware of the fact that you operate differently than a lot of the other people around you. And so being able to open up that conversation and have neurotypical people realize, okay, like the ideas that I had of neurodivergency were maybe too surface or like stereotypical, and I can like think about this differently now. Like that's a big deal as well, I think.
Great insight. Thank you so much. Nicole.
I think that part that Kearney was bringing of having visibility and representation is so important because you want both people who are experiencing this to feel seen and know that, hey, you aren't the only one. There's a power in actually being able to connect with a character in a book. I know that for me has been really healing many times, so it's something that I love to see in a book. And like I think Leo was telling earlier, the fact that more authors are giving, it was either Leo or Courtney, I forget. But they were talking about people actually saying this person is neurotypical in their books, adding that label. It's not just about, hey, it's a label. No, it's about owning that part of us. And as human beings, we have a bunch of different personalities that go into who we are. And this is only a part of who we are, but it's also good to own it and be connecting with people who are also like this. And I think that's something that's very powerful of understanding neurodiversity and actually trying to learn about it and apply it in your works is that what Andy was telling people who are and a neurodivergent in any way. I know people who are not are also like this, but in this realm is very typical to have a very strong sense of a why you do things, why you have your quirks or your very strong sense of what you believe in. So I actually think that this can help you create characters that have a stronger voice, and that people can actually connect to them and say, I understand them so well because I see what drives them. And I think that that's something that when you're meeting a person that's neurodivergent, it's very easy to start seeing what they are passionate about and what drives them to be and to overcome or to just be this amazing person that they are. And the fact that you can start learning about that and applying it to your books is going to make for a really, really awesome piece of work. So I just love seeing that type of characters just because of that. And people embracing them because they can grow so much just from understanding them.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nicole. And Leo.
Yeah, I really like what's already been said. I totally agree that there is value for all readers and for, I think, all people in understanding more about how neurodiversity works and like all of the different ways that people can interact with the world and perceive the world. And I think one important thing to note is that a lot of types of neurodivergence are things that you're born with. They're just genetic, they're inherited. But some types of neurodivergence can happen later in life. Trauma can change the way that your brain functions. And so for someone who might be in their 30s or 40s and for the first time experiencing their brain behaving in a different way than they're used to, that can be really scary and overwhelming. And if we have a lot of easily accessible resources that help people understand, like, nope, this is just a new way of being, that can help with that sort of transition to like seeing the world a different way. And I personally think that I benefit every time that I understand more about experiences that aren't my own. I think it makes me a more empathetic person. I think it makes me a more well-rounded person. And so I think there's always not even just outside of neurodiversity, but understanding different types of neurodiversity and how someone might perceive it differently from myself. And I think the third, and I think it's important within the publishing community to understand neurodiversity because actually this is in some ways kind of prescient. There has been a lot of conversations on Twitter lately in response to an author coming out about their experiences in being let go from an agent because of accommodations that he asked for. And that has led to a conversation of a lot of authors within the community talking about how they feel like they need to hide their neurodiversity, they need to not ask for accommodations, they need to try and write things in ways that neurotypical people are more used to at the expense of making the book less readable to the neurodivergent people that they actually want the book to be for. And I think if we had more information and people understood more about neurodiversity and ways to work with neurodivergent authors and like just in any industry working with neurodivergent people, there would be more great art for everyone to enjoy.
Thank you so much, Leo. That was wonderful. So on the flip side, let's talk about the negatives. Let's talk about some of the stereotypes that are in fiction or just even in news cycles, things that you see that are just incorrect, negative, harmful, outdated. So what are some of these stereotypes that are being done, even if they're not doing it knowingly? Andy.
You know, this is one that comes up a lot that I've seen and encountered in just about every piece of literature or TV or movie that deals with ASD, and people, they misunderstand the character or the person's words and laugh it off as humor, like, oh, you're so funny, without actually understanding that, you know, that the person said what he said or she said or they said in meaning it. Like it's almost like a way of brushing it off, that it kind of cuts the character, like the character with ASD, it cuts away their experience because it's just a joke, right? The person who they're talking to doesn't understand that maybe they really don't understand what the person says. So they say something, they take what was said literally, and then they respond with a question or confusion or something. And then everybody laughs it off. It's a great joke. It's so funny. You know, you're so cool. You're so quirky, whatever. And it kind of waters down the person's experience. They were genuinely confused or didn't understand something in that moment, and they asked a question. So it's a super minor thing. I would say it's even like the tiniest microaggression that they have when it comes to dealing with these things. But it's something that I see, and I'm like, oh, I wish that they would make the characters who were talking with the ASD person actually understand and respond that way, as opposed to just brushing it off.
Thank you, Andy. Leo, I saw you coming first.
Okay. I would say one thing that is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine is the presentation of neurodiversity as like a very static set of traits and symptoms that kind of are on a dimmer switch, right? So you're either over here where you're basically not, you're basically just like everyone else, but you're maybe a little bit mean and extra smart, or you're over here and you are like completely unable to connect or communicate in any way. And like a lot of times when a character is presented as being on this end of the spectrum, they're almost treated more as a piece of furniture or as an object that enhances the lives of neurotypical characters. They're more of like a learning device than an actual person. And I think in reality, neurodiversity, even when it comes in the form of specific conditions like autism spectrum disorder or ADHD, is a really dynamic thing. Different people will have different set of symptoms. And not only that, but they'll affect people differently at different times and in different situations. I can have in the same day, I can have someone be like, oh my goodness, like I can't even tell, you must have grown out of it. And like a couple hours later, I can have someone who like calls me a slur because I'm tapping myself and I can't talk. Like it can really be that vast within a single person. And like I think this is something that I've seen a lot because I'll try to talk about harmful presentations of people who have meltdowns or are non-speaking and autistic. And especially when I'm talking to parents, they'll be like, oh no, you don't understand. Like my kid is really autistic. Like my kid like screams and hits themselves and they do all these things. And I'm like, so do I, but I don't film it and put it on YouTube. Like it's this attitude that autism is just, you have a percentage of it and that's where you're at. And what I'd like to see more done well is like neurodiverse characters whose neurodiversity is dynamic. It affects them differently at different times. And it can be, it can be a problem for them right when they don't want it to be, as sometimes happens with me. Or there are times where they may be able to pass. And like, sometimes that's the same character. That doesn't mean that everyone, because there are some people who genuinely are non-speaking the vast majority of the time or all the time. And there are people who are, their symptoms maybe aren't as visible to other people. But yeah, and I also feel like I've been in that position of knowing what I want to say and what I want to communicate and not being able to. And it is really exhausting and hurtful the way that people treat me as if because I can't communicate in the way they're used to, I don't have anything to say. And people don't believe that it gets that way for me because I can seem very articulate, but that is a reality. And just because a character is not speaking or utilizes a different mode of communication like signing or an assisted communication device doesn't mean that they are less emotionally intelligent, less grounded than anyone else.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Leo and Courtney.
Yeah, so definitely echoing everything that Andy and Leo have said. I think what they said is like really great and really on point. I sat there with this question and was just like listing out different presentations that I've seen of different, facets of neurodivergency that have really just sat with me really wrong. I mean, one of the big ones that I've seen is where like bipolar and borderline personality disorder is seen as like unstable or crazy. That particular stereotype is awful and I hate it. I've also seen a lot of dissociative identity disorder, schizophrenia, PTSD in particular, where their disorder is seen as inherently violent. And that is just flat out not true. And I mean, most of the time, people who are neurodivergent have experienced violence on them more so than they are violent themselves. And that's just something that I see portrayed all over the place. And it's just flat out like not true. Even something as something like ADHD being portrayed like solely as the young white cishet boy in class that can't sit still and is disruptive and all of this stuff. That's very much the only presentation of like ADHD that I had been familiar with until I started looking into more into it myself and realizing like, oh, just kidding. That's not all it is. And that's something that is pervasive like throughout even the medical community and the like clinical community, and something that I think is part of the reason that like stereotypes are so harmful. Like it's not just about the fact that I mean the fact that you're representing a group of people like incorrectly is terrible and like bad, and it is very harmful to like individual people like just in emotion wise, but it also having these stereotypes that they're inherently harmful because it perpetuates ideas throughout like society of what those what each neurodivergence like looks like. And if you present outside of those stereotypes, then you're either not believed or you're dismissed. So like for me personally, one of the biggest things that I struggled with trying to get an ADHD diagnosis was that I had one doctor in particular that, because I had been diagnosed with anxiety disorders and depression before that, he was like, well, you did really well in school. You're able to hold down jobs and relationships. So I think you're just anxious, even though my testing showed like, no, that's not what's all that's going on. And he very much refused to look beyond what he saw as a typical presentation of ADHD. And it took me 2 more years past that to actually find somebody who would listen to me and listen to what my internal experience was like. Because a lot of the time, people's internal experiences aren't going to match what those stereotypes are. And that doesn't make them any less valid. But the way that they're perpetuated definitely does not help that like at all.
Excellent points. Thank you so much. And Nicole.
Yeah, I think that what Kearney was bringing up is very important. We need to be very aware that as writers, we have a huge power of bringing things to light, but also perpetuating things that are not correct. And there's a lot of unconscious bias that has been created by media and by books and just all sort of works trying to make something more interesting, maybe. I don't know. Like how she was talking about mental illness being seen as someone who is inherently violent. This is something that has been perpetuated for so long, and it can actually affect a person who's looking for a job. Because uh, a recruiter might be thinking, I don't want to put my other employees in harm's way, and that's not how it works. So we have to be very careful about that. And I think another thing to keep in mind is the stereotype that these are all childhood conditions. I think that we've in some way all mentioned that this still goes on, or it can be diagnosed very late on. That was my and my partner's experience. We actually got a diagnosis very later on as adults. So this is not something that only happens in children or only happens in childhood and then you grow out of it. Especially, you have to keep in mind that a lot of people learn to mask their conditions, and that's something that you have to be very careful with if you want to then do a character that also does sort of masking. You don't want to be, I don't know, too hard on this idea that everyone who is autistic should be able to mask in order to feel accepted or to feel that they belong in society. That is something that shouldn't be perpetuated. And even though a lot of us actually do some sort of those techniques to feel more accepted, it shouldn't be necessary to actually feel like you belong. And I think last one I would like to mention is this notion that by some reason neurodiverse people are in their own world. I don't know who started saying this, but I think if there's something we can all agree on is that we are most times very aware and very overwhelmed with the world we are in. So it's not that because we fidget or we do these behaviors, we are spacing out and going into our own worlds. We are actually very aware of where we are and we maybe don't understand it and we feel overwhelmed because of that. And just think of you if you went to a different country and you didn't speak the language. That would be very frustrating and very stressful. And that's how many times it feels for me when I'm around people and I have to be thinking, okay, they did this. This means that thing in social interactions. I have to have this dictionary open in my brain of social interaction, and it can be very, very overwhelming and just draining altogether. So those are things that we have to keep in mind because if we continue to feed the stereotypes, we will continue to feed the unconscious bias. And like Theo was bringing up, there's a lot of people who are missing opportunities because other people have this idea of what conditions or not neurodiversity is like, and we don't want to be part of the community that's actually perpetuating something that's making others not able to succeed in what they are passionate about.
Thank you so much, Nicole. So I'd like to add one more question on the end of this, partially because I don't want to end on a negative note. So we've talked a lot about the negative stereotypes and the things we've seen in media that have been upsetting or just inaccurate. But let's talk about what you would love to see in media. Like, what type of book would you love to see representation? Things that you don't typically see. What would make you so excited? Just you personally, even. Nicole.
I have to say, I'm super excited for Andy's book. I think that that's a character that will be very, I feel like, pure-hearted to read in how they see the world and how they actually, take it all in. So that's an example of something that we don't see enough of. And there's a lot of these conditions that are actually very unknown and very beautiful in a sense. Another thing that I think I would like to see more of is the people who can communicate, because we still have this misconception that this type of neurodiverse individual actually doesn't understand or is not intelligent, and that's not it at all. They are very intelligent and they are very passionate about things that actually are beautiful. And if we can start bringing more of those people into our works, we can start showing who they are in, like we said, our little bubble, because we will definitely not cover the whole spectrum, but we can start showing that these are people who are amazing and they have beautiful ways to see the world they are interacting with, and they're not closed off and not understanding everything around them. They're just sometimes very overwhelmed, and we need to dare to get those characters in the pages.
Thank you so much, Nicole. That was fantastic. So anybody else want to, Courtney?
Yeah, so one of the things that I personally want to see like a lot more of is neurodivergent people in healthy romantic relationships. And actually just any kind of relationship with anybody, whether that's platonic, familial, romantic, whatever. But personally, because I like romance threads in books. But like, one of the things that I think happens quite a bit is that neurodivergent people can be seen as either not good partners for whatever reason or not capable of being in a romantic relationship. And that's just flat, like untrue. Not that things can't be difficult with them, especially if you're with a neurotypical partner, because there can be like communication issues and things like that. But definitely seeing healthy romance like blossoming between two people and one of, with neurodivergence, like that's something that I really want to see more of, because that's just life. And I love romance threads and things like so much. And being able to see representation of that, and again being able to have visibility for other people and to show everyone that it's like, this is, we're still people, we're still going to experience things that everybody else does. And also in health, it can definitely be in healthy ways. They don't have to be unhealthy, they don't have to be unstable or violent or whatever. Like, they can be these beautiful relationships with people, and I just really want to see more of that.
Wonderful. I absolutely agree. That sounds wonderful. And Leo?
Yeah, I completely agree. I would love to see more romantic relationships with people who have neurodiversity. I'd love to see I think a cool thing about how very narrow the representation of neurodiversity has tended to be is that it gives us so many places we can go. Some things that I'd really, really love to see are not just obviously identities and people dealing with multiple types of neurodiversity and all of those different kinds of interesting experiences. But I'd love to see just more types of personalities. Like, not every neurodivergent person is just kind of mean, doesn't get jokes. Like, I had a character, I'm currently writing, obviously, a novel, and I had a main character who is autistic. And I was like, oh, but they're really sarcastic, and autistic people aren't really supposed to get sarcasm. Are people going to think that I'm not being accurate? And then I was like, wait a minute, Leo, you're autistic and you do sarcasms, so the character can do that too. And so yeah, I'd love to see more funny autistic characters or neurodivergent characters. I'd love to see characters who are sensitive, because there's this perception that neurodivergent people are all really heartless and don't understand other people's emotions, when for many of us, we're almost overly empathetic. We predict emotions that don't exist in other people and try to fix them. We're like, oh no, you're so hurt, you're so angry. And they're just like, I'm just chilling, bro, it's fine. And I think, yeah, being able to see more just of a variety of different kinds of characters. I'm a strong believer in that most stories can work. It's just making them work. And so if you have in your mind, you want to represent an autistic character who is really funny and constantly making jokes and wisecracking, like mine is, or, a person with ADHD who doesn't seem like it because the inside they seem very mellow and down to earth, but they're experiencing a lot going on inside. Or anything, those can work. It's just understanding the condition or the experience that you're talking about, coming at it from a place of empathy and listening to people from that group when they explain to you where things might be wrong, even if you are a member, because it's worth, just because I'm autistic doesn't mean that I write perfect representation every time. It's worth understanding how other people might perceive what I do as well.
Thank you so much. And Andy, go ahead.
You know, this is one of the things that drew me into the Dragon Mage novel so much, the one I mentioned earlier. It was just like from right away, the first interaction between the two characters, the ASD and non-ASD character, there was just like acceptance, right? The guy was just like, okay, cool. You know, like he accepted the ASD character quirks and all. He didn't necessarily dive into the deep conversation and getting to know you. You know, that all comes throughout the book, but just right off the bat, he was the first character in the book who didn't see the main character as strange. There was just this acceptance. And I think that's something that if we see more of that represented in the stories we read or TV shows and movies, our kids, you know, historically stories and fiction have always been used to teach some kind of lesson. So teaching this sort of just like acceptance and understanding, and eventually, you know, like building these relationships, not, you know, asking why is this person doing this thing, but just right off the bat, that kind of acceptance. I think that's something for me that's worth its weight in gold.
Thank you so much, Andy. Thank you, everyone. Is there anything anyone would like to add? Just advice for people wanting to write neurodiverse characters that maybe aren't neurodiverse themselves, or just any tips, anything you would like to share with folks? Nicole.
I think that's something that I would like to add is something that I myself struggle with, even being neurodiverse myself when I'm writing, is sometimes even us, we feel like maybe I'm not neurodiverse enough to be writing this character or this work. So I think that it is important to know that we all have a voice worth sharing, and that as long as we all have said you come from a place of empathy and trying to stop perpetuating these things that are so wrong and start bringing awareness to what is right and is kind and is going to build a better tomorrow in a sense, then you are completely qualified and you have value and what your work will be. So if you're neurodiverse and maybe like me, you're thinking maybe I'm not enough, you are. Your experience matters. And if you're not, just do your research, come from a place of empathy, and they're there to do it. You can do it for sure.
Excellent point. And I know imposter syndrome is like typically pretty common in the neurodiverse community. I know I experience it. Leo, I saw you unmute a moment ago. You go ahead.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think an important thing to just that I tend to note when I'm talking to writers from outside a community is that a lot of times the first instinct when a person notices that a story is missing from the world is I need to tell this story. And I totally get that. But for me, I would say if you are a person um who is not, you know, neurodiverse or not necessarily of the community that you're talking about, um the first instinct shouldn't be I'm noticing that there's no books about, you know, people with ADHD. I need to tell the story for them. The first instinct should be I need to find the people with ADHD trying to tell that story and support them. Um it's really important that this is done in a spirit of caring about the actual people who are living with these conditions. And like a person may not necessarily have a formal diagnosis, but still be a member of the community. It's not a matter of like you have to show your papers or anything like that. And if you are really like drawn to a particular experience and it like really resonates with you, that could potentially be a sign. Like if you're like, wow, everything that I read about people who have this condition just like gets to my heart, I really care, then that could be either a sign that you have a lot of empathy for those people, or it could be a sign that that is your experience. People do realize this about themselves very late. But yeah, the focus should be when we're writing about neurodiverse characters, understanding that ultimately it is about the people, and creating an environment in which we have opportunities to tell our own stories and in which we can enjoy and engage with the stories that you tell, not for us, but in collaboration with us so that there's just more information about us in the world.
Excellent. Thank you, Leo. And Courtney.
Yeah, so definitely echoing everything Leo and Nicole have said, but also just in a more general like publishing journey like aspect, if you're looking to publish, um, being neurodivergent can be a struggle in this industry, especially because it's an isolating experience, like, and it's only recently that a lot of people have been talking about their own experiences and letting other people know, like, hey, this is normal, or hey, this is not normal for this experience to happen. And especially when you're neurodivergent, that isolation can feel 1,000 times more so than it does for other people. And also, I think it's very difficult for a lot of people to look at, kind of keep your eyes on your own paper, and like, because everybody's at their journey at different places. And I know, like, for myself, even on the literary agent side, I'm constantly wondering, am I moving quickly enough? Do I have enough clients? I have other agents who have been here as long as me, and they have more sales than I do. They have more clients than I do. Am I not enough? Like, am I not moving quickly enough? But it's also okay for you to move at your own pace, because a lot of the time, being neurodivergent, it I don't want to say it limits your capacity, but like sometimes you just have to move at your own pace. Sometimes your journey isn't going to move like as quickly as others, but that's okay. And you being, you moving like at a slower pace or whatever pace is comfortable for you, that doesn't mean you're any less valid or worthy or deserving of the goals that you're going for. It just means that you're having to move at your own pace, and that's okay. And I just want to make sure all my little neurodivergent people watching this know that.
Thanks so much, Courtney. All right. Well, I think that wraps up everything I wanted to cover today. And I think everyone had some amazing points and really great information that our attendees are really going to enjoy. So I want to personally thank you all for being here today and for being willing to discuss this with all of us. And we will be talking in Discord. Thank you so much.